Greetings and salutations. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of One Question for Every Fight, this time focused on UFC Vegas 68, which takes place on Saturday at the UFC APEX. Originally scheduled for Seoul, South Korea. Unfortunately, some fighters that were going to be a part of that show, primarily the Korean Zombie, Chan Sung Jung, unable to compete, and therefore the UFC made the tough decision to bring the event from Seoul to the UFC APEX, inserted the canceled headliner from November, Derek Lewis versus Sergey Spivak, into the main event here for a fight card that features the 4 tournament finales from the Road to UFC fight card, or UFC series, I should say. Features the color commentary, main card, fight night event debut of Laura Sanko, a story that is near and dear to my heart, having spoken to Laura throughout this journey about this being one of the things on her checklist of things that she would like to accomplish. So I'm excited for my friend and my colleague to see her get that opportunity. She's done a great job on the Road to UFC series throughout. I do wish that her partner for the first 2 rounds, John Gooden, was going to be beside her on Saturday in Las Vegas. But alas, we get Laura, and that's a start. And we will start on these fights. So as always, one question. We go top down, main event through all of them. And I know you're probably sitting there being like, really? You've got a question about all of these? I do, ladies and gentlemen. I love this stuff. I paid attention to the Road to UFC. I did the recaps for the UFC website, but I also just, you know me. And if you're just getting on board, you're going to come to know I care about each and every one of these fights. There's something meaningful about each and every one of these fights. Maybe not to you, maybe not to the masses, but to the competitors involved, their teams, their families, and the divisions. I think every fight has a little bit of a ripple effect. And so we're going to go through it. We start at the main event as always. Derek Lewis, Sergey Spivak, rescheduled from November, as I said. And my question is, where are each of these guys at right now? This is a perfect matchup to me. I loved it when it first was scheduled in November because it feels like this is the fight that each guy needs to answer this particular question. Derek Lewis, a perennial contender, a guy that has always sort of been right on the fringes of title contention, kind of the gatekeeper to championship contention, if we're being fully transparent. He has lost his last 2 fights. He is 1-3 in his last 4, but those losses are to Cyril Gane, Tai Tuivasa, and Sergey Pavlovich, who are all top 5 fighters. Whereas Sergey Spivak comes in having won 2 straight, 5-1 in his last 6. The losses to Tom Aspinall. But the best win, and I say this respectfully, is Augusto Sakai, who hasn't been able to climb past about number 8 or 9 in the heavyweight division. And so with the weight class in flux, with a new champion to be determined next month in Las Vegas, John Jones, Cyril Gane fighting for that belt, some uncertainty in terms of where everybody fits right now, we get this fight that is going to tell us, for these 2 gentlemen, where they are. Is Derek Lewis at age 38, this many miles, this many fights coming off back-to-back stoppage losses, still the guy he was? Is he still the guy you have to beat to get into that top 5, top 7 range? Is Sergey Spivak somebody capable of getting there? Is he someone that, despite some struggles early in his UFC career, has started to really put it together and figure out who he is, fight to his strengths, learn what he needs to do in the cage to be successful, and capable of going out on Saturday and getting the biggest win of his career? That's why I love this fight. I know it's one of those fights that we joke about on the preview show often, of it's number 7 versus number 9, and when they're done, one is number 7 and one is number 9. And that's probably true in terms of where they'll be with the numbers next to their names in the rankings. But from a understanding standpoint of who these people are right now, this is going to be the thing that helps us determine and figure out where they fit and what the rest of this year looks like. And if Derek Lewis is now officially on the downside of things, or if Sergey Spivak is truly somebody that can join that group of younger emerging fighters that hasn't fought for championship gold yet and hasn't been in those big fights yet. This is a pivotal fight. It's an important fight. I hope we get it. I hope everybody makes it to the Octagon safely and in full health on Saturday. I'm really looking forward to this one. Move to the co-main event, Da Un Jung against Devin Clark. My question here is, are we too quick to dismiss fighters? And I'll explain. So Jung went 4-0-1 in his first 5 fights in the UFC. He loses to Dustin Jacoby last time out. And we're just kind of out on him. We just kind of determined that that means he's not a guy that we need to pay attention to in the light heavyweight division. And that just feels a little bit misguided to me. Now, maybe people were not in on him to begin with. Maybe he is always profiled to the majority of people as somebody that is just going to top out in that just outside of the top 15 range where he currently sits, in that second 15, as I would call it. But like, it's 1 loss in 7 fights in the UFC. He's 5-1-1. That's a pretty respectable record in the UFC. Granted, it hasn't been against the greatest competition. It hasn't been against a murderer's row of light heavyweights. But he's also only 29 years old. He's still sort of figuring it out. He's shown some upside. And it just feels to me like we are stuck in this deliver now or you can't deliver ever sort of cycle of assessment. Whereas for me personally, I take a lot more of a, well, let's just see what happens. This is a really interesting fight to me because I want to see how Da Un Jung responds to that loss. He went out and made mistakes against Dustin Jacoby on Long Island. He got into a fist fight with a guy that is better at fist fighting than he is. He went out and tried to have a kickboxing match with a guy that fought in Glory Kickboxing and won gold in Glory Kickboxing, if I'm not mistaken. That's probably not going to be the case against Devin Clark, who is a big, strong, powerful wrestler, looks to get inside, looks to clinch, things of that nature, has gigantic tree trunks for thighs. And so I want to see if Jung can come out, learn from that fight, and rebound right away. Because as good as 5-1-1 is, 6-1-1 looks even better and gets you moving forward again. And again, while Devin Clark isn't a world beater and is a guy that has been 500 in the UFC thus far, it's still a good win. And in a division where it doesn't take a ton of wins to move forward and start getting into the lower third of that top 15, where Jacoby is, where Khalil Roundtree is, where Paul Craig is, then you need to pay attention. You need to see these fights. And to dismiss somebody and throw somebody away and discard their opportunities or their potential at 29 off 1 loss feels short-sighted to me. So I want to see if that's the case. Move again to the heavyweight division, or we return to the heavyweight division for the European title. Marcin Tybura, Blagoy Ivanov. My question here is, how come Tybura isn't spoken about as the heavyweight Neil Magny? So if you've listened to the preview show, if you've listened to me on any of the series that I put out here on the SevereMMA YouTube page, you know how highly I think of Neil Magny. Most wins in welterweight history. Guy that is out there 3 times a year like clockwork, 4 times if he can, 5 times once before. Beats all the guys he's supposed to beat. Sure, he's struggled against the upper echelon, but he's had a tremendous career, especially when you look at the way it started, right? 1-2 out of the gate coming off The Ultimate Fighter. Wasn't supposed to be a guy that hung around and stuck around and has turned himself into a top 15 fixture. And as I mentioned, the guy with the most wins in welterweight history. Say what you will about longevity, say what you will about number of appearances, he's put up the victories. Tybura is 10-5 in the UFC. He's 6-1 in his last 7. And again, like, this is one of those fights that Shawnee hates because it's 2 guys that are just outside of the top 10, and it doesn't really have a great deal of jeopardy or stakes in terms of where the division goes next. But to me, I look at someone like Tybura and I think, man, we don't appreciate this guy enough for what he's done. As I said, 6-1 in his last 7. That's really impressive. The loss is Alexander Volkov, who has been a top 7 fighter in the heavyweight division from the minute he walked into the UFC. and may still have some more upside given what we saw last time out against Jairzinho Rosenstruck. We need guys like Marcin Tybura in every division. And it's just curious to me that we heap praise on someone like Neil Magny. We heap praise on the Jim Millers of the world and the Jeremy Stevenses prior to that, and these athletes that maintain their place in the top 15 but haven't gotten into that championship set and have the record that Magny has, have the record that Tybura has, but we don't carry that over to heavyweight. For some reason, we don't apply that to Marcin Tybura, who has done essentially the same things. He doesn't have necessarily the big high profile wins or the highest profile win that maybe Neil Magny has, but he's got some good wins. Beat Alexander Romanov last time out when Romanov was a massive favorite and undefeated. Those are important things. And these kinds of fighters that can do that, like Tybura, are important. They make the divisions go. They are critical to the ecosystem of every weight class. And as best we can, as often as we can, we need to appreciate them and recognize them for who they are, for what they bring to the table, because it's not as good if we don't have these people. It's not as these divisions and these weight classes aren't as good if we don't have men and women like this that go out and compete 2-3 times a year and are the litmus test for the emerging set or the guys that are trying to get into the top 15 or the top 10 or wherever it is that they sit. Marcin Tybura is the heavyweight version of Neil Magny to me. And I love Neil Magny and I love me some Marcin Tybura. Move to featherweight, Doo-Ho Choi, the Korean Superboy versus Canadian Kyle Nelson. My question here is, do you want to know why we talk so much about damage and protecting fighters? Here's why. Doo-Ho Choi was 14-1, blasting through folks in the UFC. I was at his debut in Austin, Texas against Juan Puig. He was smashing fools before UFC 206 when he fought Cub Swanson in a fight that got inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, rightfully so, last summer. That fight was a 15-minute knockdown, drag out, epic, gnarly battle, which he lost by unanimous decision. And he hasn't been the same since. He went through that fight and it was a hellacious fight. It was a tremendous fight, but it was one of those fights that changes a fighter. Doo-Ho Choi hasn't been the same since. He's been knocked out savagely in each of his last 2 appearances, one against Jeremy Stephens, one against Charles Jourdain. Admittedly, 2 guys that can crack, 2 guys that can put you away with the right shot. But that fight changed him forever. And a career that was on the upswing has never really gotten there. Now, a bunch of other things have come into play. He's had injuries. He had his military requirements that he had to go and serve. So he's now 31 years old and returning to the UFC again. Hasn't fought since the fight with Charles Jourdain, which was at the end of 2019. The end of 2019 in Busan, South Korea. And he's fighting Kyle Nelson, who is 1-4 in the UFC. And this is, as much as Choi is rightfully a huge favorite, it's also him sort of fighting for his place in this division. Maybe not necessarily on the roster, because I don't think he gets let go if he loses a 4 straight fight, because he is one of a group of South Korean athletes that the UFC has on the roster that if and when the opportunity to return to Seoul or somewhere in South Korea presents itself again, you want to have him in the fold. But like, this is a fight where we're going to find out what Doo-Ho Choi has left, who he is going forward. And if you want to see the point where all of those things changed, where some of the upside that he possessed got whittled away and we had to start lower in the bar, it's that fight at UFC 206. We don't appreciate enough the toll that some of these fights and some of these efforts that we love and fairly duly love take on these men and women. And so when we get on here, as Harry and I did after UFC 283, and talk about Lauren Murphy and talk about Glover Teixeira. And these athletes respond, as Lauren Murphy did, and say, you guys don't care. It's just pretend, it's performative care. No, it's not. Not for me, it's not. Not for Harry, it's not. I saw Doo Ho Choi when he was truly this fresh-faced Superboy in his debut and thought, Jesus, this guy could be something. And watched him win those first 3 fights and went into that fight with Cub Swanson thinking, man, if he beats Cub, he's a top 10 fighter in this emerging division. And it hasn't been the same since, and it's because of that fight. In part, you can't deny it. He went through hell in that fight and hasn't been the same since. And that's why we talk about these things. That's why we harp on protecting fighters and mitigating damage and stopping fights, whether you're the corner, the doctor, the officials. Careers get shortened with those kinds of fights. And as much as we love them, and I love them just as much as the next person, probably a little more, we also have to understand and recognize and discuss the other side of it. And who Doo Ho Choi is today is the other side of it. Move to the welterweight division. Yusaku Kinoshita versus Adam Fugit. My question here is, what is Kinoshita's ceiling? So, actually really like this fight because Adam Fugit did well in his short notice promotional debut against Michael Morales, a Contender Series alum as well, who has looked good thus far. Kinoshita looked good on his win in the Contender Series, fought a guy named Jose Henrique, who is a gigantically tall welterweight from Brazil, has a lot of length, has a lot of reach, and he did extremely well navigating that fight, eventually getting a 3rd round knockout, beautiful left hand to put him down, and then coffin nails, and we get the finish. He's 22 years old, 5-0 as an amateur, 6-1 as a pro. The loss as a pro is for, according to Tapology, grabbing the fence. So it looks like it's a DQ as opposed to he actually caught a loss. Somebody beat him handily. Loads of room to grow, loads of time to do so. Seems like a pretty intriguing fighter to me. He was one of the people from last year's group of Contender Series fighters that got the yellow highlighter treatment from me. Let me just see this guy when he comes back. Because listen, Henrique, who he beat, doesn't yet understand how to be a gigantic, long, tall fighter. And so that works in Kinoshita's favor. And it's why I like this fight with Fugit. As I said, this is a guy that's 8-3 or 8-4 now as a pro, 34 years old, been around, fought good competition on the regional circuit, knocked out Solomon Renfro before getting to the UFC. A guy that if you check out Fight Pass, you watch some of the regional events there, you'll see a lot of Solomon Renfro, highly regarded, had some success in some bigger regional promotions. And so this is one that's going to tell us sort of right away, maybe not necessarily what the ceiling is, but it's going to set a baseline. It's going to set a floor for where Kinoshita is right now and give us a little bit of an understanding for what that progress might be over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. These are the kinds of fights that I know most people aren't all that interested in, but I absolutely adore because I want to see the progression. I love being able to track step by step by step with these athletes from Contender Series or the Ultimate Fighter or some of the regional shows on through becoming whoever they're going to be. It's a really cool adventure for me. I've been doing this long enough that there have been some athletes that I saw the start and I watched all the way through the end, and it's really cool to watch. This is another one I'm looking forward to tracking. We get into the Road to UFC finals now. Jekka Saragi versus Anshul Jubli. And my question here is, can the winner carve a lane not only for themselves, but for a nation? So Jekka Saragi is Indonesian. Anshul Jubli is from India. Two nations with a very limited history in the UFC. And truthfully, to me, one of the things about this fight card that really stands out when I looked at it and when I think about it is how important representation is. We're getting Laura Sanko, only the second woman ever to do color commentary on a UFC event, joining Kathy Long, who called UFC 1, who I know Laura has had a relationship with over the last couple of years since she started doing the Contender Series. We have athletes like Sergi from Indonesia, not represented currently in the UFC. We have Jubli, only the third Indian fighter to be in the UFC, joining Bashak Kandari and Arjun Buller. Limited success thus far for those two men. Arjun went 3-1. Kandari went 0-2, I believe, and then was bounced from the UFC. And so as you look at the continued growth of this sport, not just the UFC, the thing we're seeing, and you see it in every sport, you see it across the globe, is when you have a person you can look to and say, that person looks like me, that person is from where I'm from, then you understand that that dream is possible. And so we've seen the proliferation recently of fighters from the African continent moving into MMA. We've seen promotions come together and start growing. EFC has been there for a while, but we're seeing others come up and start to showcase that African talent. We've seen the growth and development of oceanic talent, of talent from the Pacific Rim, of talent from Europe, of all around the globe, even Canada. And so this is more of that. Jeka Saragi has been wildly entertaining. He is so much fun to watch from the minute he starts walking out throughout the fight into his post-fight press conferences. The dude is a bundle of entertainment. Jubli is, 6-0, third fighter from India, as I mentioned, won a decision to get to this point. But this is the stuff that 3-4 years down the line, when there are 2 or 3 fighters from Indonesia and 2 or 3 fighters from India, and one of them is moving on and having some prolonged success, some extended success in the Octagon or elsewhere, as Arjun Buller is doing in one championship right now. Those things matter. They resonate. And so, yes, this is a fight between 2 guys that are ostensibly making their UFC debuts or fighting truly for a spot officially on the UFC roster. But it's so much more than that. And we need to understand that. We need to appreciate that. We keep going with these fights in the road to UFC competition. We move to featherweight. Jiangliang Li versus Yi Jia. And my question is, can Li keep rolling? So in terms of the impact performances through the road to UFC series, I would say that Li has had the most impressive, the most dynamic victories. 2-0 to get to this point, obviously, winning his way to the finals. 2 KO wins in under 45 seconds. Each of his last 3 wins is under 45 seconds. He's won 6 straight. 27 years old, good size for featherweight, looks the part. As Chad Dundas would say on the Co-Main Event podcast, he looks good getting off the bus. You look at him and you go, all right, that guy looks like a contender. We're not sure yet. He's still young. He's still figuring it out. But all the pieces are there. Yi Jia is a good test. He's 10-1 in his career. He's 10-1 in his last 11. He's won 3 straight. He's got a couple more fights than that. He's looked good to get to this point. Earned a good win earlier in the season in the competition. But it's just a matter of is what we've seen thus far of Lee the real thing? Nobody is going to go through their whole career just icing people in 60 seconds or less. It just doesn't happen. But I want to see how far he can keep going with it. I want to see what happens when we get to 90 seconds in, when we get to 2 minutes in. Let me see it. Because if you go out and look, if he goes out and keeps smashing fools and wins this whole tournament and doesn't go more than a minute, well, there's a hell of a story. There's a hell of a way to announce yourself entering the UFC and walking into the featherweight division. I know it's a low profile card. I know these are fighters you are not familiar with. There are really cool stories here, and stories you're going to hear down the road when these men and women that are competing on Saturday are part of the UFC fabric. Move to bantamweight, all Japan finale in the bantamweight competition. Toshiomi Kazama against Rinya Nakamura. And my question here is, can the winner join the ascending pack of Japanese talent currently in the UFC? So I mentioned Kinoshita earlier. I will talk about Tatsuro Taira a little later on. Kazama is 25 years old, 10-2 overall. He upset Maimati, who is a tenured, seasoned Chinese fighter, in the opening round of this, and then got a decent win and moved forward into the finals. Actually, I believe he's one of the guys that got a walkover into the finals. Excuse me. His opponent missed weight, and then he passed on into the finals. Rinya Nakamura has been the guy to me that I look at as the most impressive thus far. Former under 23 world champion in freestyle wrestling, only turned pro less than 2 years ago. He's 28 at the end of March, but he's 6-0 overall, 2-0 in the tournament, pair of first round finishes. And while Lee's were sparking dudes out and landing big shots that sent people to the shadow realm, Nakamura has been methodical and like just unstoppable. Just that it's that you can't stop me from doing what I want to do and getting where I want to go style. And it really stands out. And it's really impressive for a guy that has only been fighting professionally for 18 months. We haven't had a really big star from Japan in the UFC. I would argue ever. We've had some fighters that are big names, and we've had some athletes that were stars in the past elsewhere and brought some of that mystique and standing with them to the octagon. Yoshihiro Akiyama, Takanori Gomi, Yushin Okami fought for a title, but there hasn't been anybody that's really stood out, that's really taken the mantle and run with it of being, and especially lately, of being sort of that next generation Japanese fighter, the next to inherit the throne from that group of athletes. We've had some fighters pass through that have had some success to varying degrees on both the men's and women's side of things. But this group now, with Kinoshita, Kazama, Nakamura, Tatsuro Taira, you could still put Mizuki Inoue in there if she gets healthy and comes back to action. I think Kaneko Murata can be a part of that. There are still some athletes that can get there, and I want to see if this pack can really come together and start to have an impact and have prolonged success, because I think it's important. As I said, with the Jakasaragi and Jubli fight, representation matters. They're things that draw people in from other places that maybe weren't paying attention otherwise. And so if we have a bunch of ascending Japanese talent, more fighters from Japan, more eyes from Japan, more focus in Japan, an opportunity to go and have another card in Japan. They've always been great. I'd love to see the UFC get back there. Really curious to see how this works out, to see if either of these two men can put something together, earn their way into the UFC on Saturday, and then build from there. Move to the flyweight finale, an all South Korean battle. Sunguk Choi versus Hyun Sung Park. My question here is, who wins this clash of styles? So Choi has won 2 decisions. Park has won 2 fights in the first round. Choi's 6-1 for his career, won 5 straight, member of Team Korean Zombie. Park is 7-0, 5 straight finishes, does a bunch of his training with the Bang Tao crew, the Hickman brothers, out in Phuket, Thailand. Both have looked good in different ways, different styles, clearly different elements. And so I'm really just curious to see, like, these are 2 fighters that are still relatively young in their careers and have had primarily success, right? A combined 13-1 overall. Nice winning streaks coming in, have won 12 straight overall combined coming in. So how do they deal with someone else that's in that same position and that has a different style than them and is looking to dictate their terms? Is Park going to be able to get to his finishing opportunities? Is Choi going to be a little bit more reserved and a little bit more willing to play the back foot and see if he can find ways to get in and drag this out and test Park's gas tank if we get into second and third rounds? It's a compelling matchup to me. And I know that I am one of the few, because I watched these fights. This is going to be a good fight. It's going to be an entertaining chess match between these two. And I look forward. I mean, we talk all the time about flyweight. The winner of this is going to be a nice little addition to that burgeoning flyweight division that just keeps getting better. I know tomorrow is 10 things I like. I like this fight card. I know I'm not supposed to say that. I know I'm supposed to be down on. I like this fight card. This is very much a Spencer card where me and like 7 other people are excited about it, but I like this fight card. Hope you do too. We move on. Flyweight division, Jeon Kim, Mandy Bohm. My question here is, can Kim finally do enough to get the nod? So Jeon Kim has lost 4 straight. Most of them were close fights. A couple were debatable decisions. Priscilla Cachoeira fight, especially the loss to Molly McCann, was very close. Even the fight with Jocelyn Edwards last time out, relatively close fight. She's always competitive. She's tough to put away, but she's never quite really, of late, done enough to get it done. I've spoken with Jeon Kim a couple times. She's made sacrifices in her life in terms of coming to the United States and training at Syndicate for long stretches. It's tough to see somebody like this continue to struggle and come up just short. Like I would almost argue that it would be easier to get blown out repeatedly and just go, well, I guess I'm not quite good enough to be at this level, than to be that close, to be maddeningly close every time out and still just not get there. And in some cases, everybody thinks you did enough to get there, except the 3 people scoring the fight. It's got to be hard. So she fights Mandy Bohm on Saturday, who is 0-2 in the UFC, lost last time out to Victoria Leonardo, who is someone that came off of the Contender Series, but struggled in her first couple UFC appearances. This is a winnable fight for Jeon Kim. I believe she's the favorite going in, as she probably should be. Overall experience, performance thus far in the UFC. But she's got to be locked in from the go, from jump. And this has to be like her most complete, her best performance, start to finish. If it can be, she's going to get that win. And I can't imagine how relieving it will be to stand in the center of that octagon and get her hand raised. And I'm looking forward to seeing if she can do it. As I said, I've spoken to her a few times. I know how difficult this road has been. There's been a bunch of cancellations in there as well that makes things even tougher when you're all set, ready to go, and then a fight falls apart. And then you do get out there and you just come up short. Looking forward to see if Jeon Kim can get it done on Saturday. Hope she does. Move to the middleweight division. Jun-Yong Park versus Dennis Tiulian. My question here, and it's one that I ask most weeks on one question: can Park make a run at middleweight? That name changes, right? Last time out, it was RoboCop, Gregory Rodriguez. We got that answer. He factors in here too, because Park has won 2 straight. He's 5-1 in his last 6, with the only loss coming to Gregory RoboCop Rodriguez in a back and forth fight that I thought deserved a little more recognition, a little more consideration in the fight of the year race in 2021. He's shown solid durability, good conditioning, a little bit of pop. Like there's pieces of a well-rounded, multifaceted fighter from Jun-Yong Park thus far. But he turns 32 at the end of February. And so it sort of kind of feels like a now or never situation. Like if you're going to make a run, now's the time. And Tiulian is a guy that if you are going to make a run, you got to go out and beat, and probably beat handily. He lost his debut against Aliasab Hizraev, which was short notice. Fine. Beat Jamie Pickett in his sophomore appearance, full camp, all of that. He's good, but not great in my estimation. He's 11-6 overall. He's 1-1 in the UFC, as I just said. Fought some good competition, lost to the best fighters he's faced type of guy. And so if Park is going to do something, you're at 2 wins now. You go out and make it a 3-fight winning streak. Now you're getting a little step up in competition. Now maybe you're getting Bruno Ferreira, who beat RoboCop last weekend. Maybe you're getting a fight like that, which maybe feels like a step back, but the guy's coming off beating the guy that you beat. So there's some synergy to a fight like that. Maybe you get somebody, a veteran, a little further along. I know Gerald Meerschaert is booked, but somebody in that Gerald Meerschaert range. Maybe you get Chris Jotko. Maybe you get a deeper look to see how far you can go. If you're going to get there, this is the week it starts. This is the fight where you make it happen. I want to see if it can happen. Partially, simply because I love the fact that his name is the Iron Turtle, but I also think that there is some talent there. And middleweight, as I say every week, can use more names, can use new talent. So let's see if Jung Young Park can do what Gregory Rodriguez did not do in Brazil. Opening fight of the card on Saturday evening is the flyweight division, Tatsuro Taira versus Jesus Aguilar. My question is, how quickly can Taira climb the ladder? If you've read me, listened to Harry, you know how we feel about Tatsuro Taira. He is one of my top 10 prospects in the UFC, as I wrote about on OSDB Sports a little earlier in the year. He's 2-0 in the UFC, 12-0 overall, 23 years old, presents as the complete package. Muhammad Mokaev has a bunch more hype and attention on him as he progresses, and he's got one extra win in the UFC, so it's justified. But Taira is right there with him. He doesn't have the decorated amateur career that Mo has, but he's on that same level of young, dynamic, well-rounded, skilled fighter coming up in the 125-pound ranks. Some people may bristle at him facing a newcomer and another Contender Series grad at that. His first two fights were against Contender Series graduates Carlos Candelario and CJ Vergara. But I actually kind of like this one because this is, to me, the first one where there's a bunch of, not necessarily pressure, but the focus and understanding of who Taira is, what he should be able to do in theory, comes into play here. Because Jesus Aguilar is a good fighter, but he's sort of one of these specialist guys that he's looking to grab guillotines. He's got a nasty choke, but like, that's kind of about it. He's a little short. He's a little short-armed for the division. And so I think that Taira should be able to roll, but being in that position is a thing you have to learn to deal with. And so at 23, I want to see him learn to deal with it. Additionally, tying into what I talked about earlier with Kazama and Nakamura, as well as Kinoshita and that group, can he be the guy that leads this next wave of Japanese talent? He profiles as a guy that can. Right now, you look at him and you go, going to be a contender. Now, development isn't linear. Things can happen, all like that. If he continues on the path he's on, if he continues performing the way he has, he will be the leader of that group. He will be a top 10 fighter in this division, if not higher, and probably fairly soon. My hope, looking at the division, and as Harry, Ian, and I talked about when we did the divisional breakdowns a couple weeks ago now, when we had that off week, or just last week, I should say, when we had that off week, there's not really a need to rush a bunch of these young guys, but they just might be too damn good to not get rushed, to not be pushed along. So you look at Mokaev facing himself next month, another newcomer, and Jafel Filo, who came off the Contender Series as well. These guys may just, I appreciate trying to slow play them because it's the thing I advocate for all the time, especially with super young talent like these two 23-year-olds. They might just be too damn good. And so if Taira goes out and smashes through Jesus Aguilar on Saturday to kick off the show, we might just have to do a little bit of like, well, let's just throw him in there with Tim Elliott and see how that goes. Let's just get him in there with Matt Schnell and see what's up. Because he might be too good to continue to just be brought along like this. And I want to find out. That's it for the questions. That's it for UFC Vegas 68. As I've said throughout, I know this is a card that a lot of people are down on. I truthfully, I understand it. We don't have to have the same opinions. We don't have to have the same viewpoints. I am not, trust me when I tell you, this excitement, this anticipation is not fake. It is not forced. I love this shit that much. Even cards like this. Again, part of it is because I followed the Road to UFC series and I'm looking forward to these finales. But I just like fights and I like watching athletes in the early stages of their UFC career and being able to track them. So I hope there has been some stuff in this series, in this show today, that gets you a little more excited for Saturday. I'll be back tomorrow with 10 things I like, breaking that down even more, hopefully to get you even more excited for Saturday. Take you from, if you're a 2 now, to maybe a 3 or a 4. Maybe get you to a 5 or a 6 by the time Saturday rolls around. Once Ian and I stop by with the picks and plays on Friday. If not, that's fine. Harry and I will be here on Tuesday to break out the takeaways, tell you all the things that you missed. Check out everybody on the site on Twitter. Check out the site itself, SevereMMA.com. Check out the Patreon, so SevereMMA.com/pints. It is well worth the price of admission. It is the start of the month, so there is no better time to get on board. What you can actually do is just click the, oh, it's not coming up for me. There we go. There it is. Click that QR code. It will take you to the Patreon. Sign up, get all the goodness that we produce on the podcasts in your ear holes every month. Well worth the price of admission, as I said. Appreciate you stopping by. Please know